Hi guys, welcome to my channel. I'm Tracy. Hi. I'd like to do a video today about Dean Arnold Corll. He was a serial killer from the 1970s known as the Houston Mass Murders. I wanted to do this video in 2022, but it's now January 4th, 2023. I had an accident in April of 2022 that caused a head injury, and I lost my memory for a while, and I had to have rehab and some rehabilitation on stuff. So I didn't get around to doing it, so now I'm doing it. Uh, there is a trigger warning. I will be using the word sexual assault, strangulation, and murders throughout the video. There is some lagging in the video on my part because of the head injury. I do use the word a lot, and my eye twitches, and I stare sometimes. So please forgive me for that, and I hope you enjoy the video. Thank you. Dean Arnold Corll was born December 24th, 1939 and passed away August 8th, 1973. He was accused of the sexual assault and murder of over 28 boys and young men between 1970 and 1973 in the Houston and Pasadena, Texas area. His accomplices were Elmer Wayne Henley and David Owen Brooks. Corll was known as the Candyman because his family owned a candy business, and at the end of his shift, he would often hand out candy to local children and teenagers that would come around after his shift would end at the candy factory. Between the years of 1970 and 1973, they were either by strangulation or by being shot. He would end the lives of these victims. He was the first child of Mary Robinson and Arnold Corll. His family was a very dysfunctional family. His mother was very overbearing, and his father was very stern. He was a very shy but seemed to be very concerned about other children. His mother and father divorced and remarried and finally ended up divorcing. His mother married Jake West in 1955, then they moved to Vidor, Texas, where Corll's half-sister Joyce Janine was born, and that's where they started their first small candy business from the garage of their home. At that point, Corll was in high school, where he occasionally dated girls, and I say occasionally. His major interest at that point was the brass band that he was involved in. In 1963, Corll's mother divorced West and opened up a new candy business that she named the Corll Candy Company, where Corll became vice president and the youngest son was secretary-treasurer. That same year, one of the teenage male employees of the Corll Candy Company complained to his mother that her son had made some sorts of sexual advances toward him, and her response to that was that she fired the young man. In 1964, Corll was drafted into the Army as a radio repairman. He did not get along with that, so he used the company was having problems at the time, so he used that as some kind of complaint and used it as a way to get out of the Army, and applied for a hardship and was granted that and got an honorable discharge and got out of the Army. In 1967, Corll met David Owen Brooks, who at that point was only 12 years old, and they had struck up a friendship, and by the time 1969 came around, they had a sexual relationship. By 1970, the murders had begun, and then by 1973, Corll was known to at least have killed 28 victims. They had ranged in the ages of 13 to 20. Most were from the Houston Heights area. They were assisted by one of both of the accomplices, Elmer Wayne Henley or David Owen Brooks. Some of these victims were even friends of both of them. The first known victim of Corll was 18-year-old Jeffrey Conan on September 25th, 1970. I'm not going to go into details of what was done to the boys, except to say that they were sexually assaulted and strangled or shot, because the details are so graphic that I'm just going to say what was done to them that way. Jeffrey Conan was strangled and sexually assaulted. And then on December the 13th, 1970, Brooks lured uh, James Glass and Danny Yates away from a religious rally that was held in Houston Heights to Corll's Yorktown apartment. Glass had been there before and thought that it was okay to go, and both boys went. And they were sexually assaulted and strangled and buried in a boat shed. 6 weeks after their murders, they ran into two teenage brothers, Donald and Jerry Walter, that was going to their home, and they sexually assaulted and strangled them and buried them in a boat shed. Between March and May of 1971, Corll abducted and murdered three other victims that lived in the Houston Heights area. They were 16-year-old Gregory Malley Winkle, 13-year-old David Halligast, and 15-year-old Randall Harvey on May 29, 1971. The next victim was on August the 17th, 1971. Corll and Brooks had encountered 17-year-old acquaintance of Brooks named Reuben Watson Haney that was walking home from a movie theater in Houston, and they had asked him to go to a party at Corll's address, and they had subsequently strangled him and buried him in the boat shed. The next thing that happened was Brooks introduced Henley to Corll, and Henley was supposed to be a victim, and he ended up being an accomplice. Corll wanted him to be an accomplice, and he offered him $200 a boy to be in this white slave. He said that he had a white slavery ring operating out of Dallas, and he would give him $200 for each boy that he would bring to this white slavery ring. And Henley at first said no to the proposition, and after a couple months he decided that he needed money for his family because his family was doing poorly, and decided that he would go along with it. And in February or early March of 1972, he brought a boy to Corll's residence and gave him over to him, thinking he was going to be gave to a white slavery ring. And then 1 month later, in March 24th of 1972, Henley, Brooks, and Corll ran into an 18-year-old acquaintance of Henley's named Frank Aguirre, and they invited him back to Corll's house and drank beer and smoked marijuana with him. And Corll handcuffed him, and Henley didn't understand what was going on. And Henley later claimed to the police officers that Corll told Henley that he was going to sexually assault and murder him, and Henley didn't understand why. And Corll informed him that he had done it to the other boy that he had brought to his house earlier, and Henley fought against it, but ended up agreeing to it, and they subsequently murdered Aguirre and buried him at High Island Beach, and then Henley became an accomplice of Brooks and Corll. And then a month later, on April the 20th, Henley, Corll, and Brooks abducted another boy, 17-year-old Mark Scott, and subsequently sexually assaulted and strangled him and buried him at High Island Beach. On June 26, Corll and Brooks abducted two youths named Billy Bulch and Johnny DeLome. Johnny DeLome was shot before he was, both of them were sexually assaulted and strangled and buried at High Island Beach. And then 19-year-old William Ridinger was abducted, and he was lured to the house. And for some reason, Brooks said that when the three of them was in the house, he was able to talk Corll into persuaded him into letting Ridinger go. I don't understand it. I've read a lot about it, but I still haven't come to conclude why he was able to persuade him to let him go. But he did. He was able to persuade him to let him go. And in that same inst- at that same apartment later on, um, Henley had brought Brooks to the apartment and knocked him unconscious, and Corll had repeatedly sexually assaulted him, and finally released him, and he still assisted him in the abductions and murders of the victims later on. I don't understand that either. I've read a lot about it too, and I don't understand it. But later on, in the summer of 1972, he is known to have killed two further victims, 17-year-old Stephen Sigmund and a 19-year-old named Roy Button. And then in October 2nd, 1972, Henley and Brooks encountered two Heights teenagers named Wally J. Simonex and Richard Hombre, who Hombre was accidentally shot in the mouth by Henley, and they later strangled both boys and buried them in a common grave inside the boat shed. And then sometime the following month, 18-year-old Willard Branch disappeared and was buried in a boat shed. On November the 15th, 19-year-old Richard Kipner, was strangled and buried at High Island Beach. Altogether, 10 teenagers between the ages of 13 and 19 were murdered between February and November of 1972, 5 of whom were buried at High Island Beach, and 5 of whom were buried inside the boat shed. In January of 1973, he had murdered 17-year-old Joseph Lyles. I'm sorry, guys. Between February 1st and June 4th of 1973, there's no known victims were actually murdered, and they believe this was because he had suffered from hydrocele. I believe I'm saying that right, but I'm not absolutely sure, guys. They think it contributed to it. Hydrocele is where the scrotum is swollen with fluid around the testicles, so they think that contributed to it. Also around that time, Hensley had temporarily moved away to get away from Corll, and that might have had something to do with it. They're not sure. But then in June, at the end of June, and June 4th, the brutality started with a vengeance. Henley and Corll abducted 15-year-old William Ray Lawrence, and after 3 days of sexual assault, they strangled and buried him at Lake Sam Rayburn. 2 weeks later, 20-year-old Rayburn Stanley Blackburn was strangled and buried at Lake Sam Rayburn. And then 15-year-old Homer Luis Garcia was shot and buried at Lake Sam Rayburn. 5 days later, on July the 12th, 17-year-old John Sellers of Orange County was shot and buried at High Island Beach. In July of 1973, Brooks married his pregnant fiancée. Then Henley became his only helper at that time, and helped with murder 3 more victims. Michael Balch was the next victim, and he was the brother of previous victim Billy Balch. And then Charles Cobble and Marty Ray Jones. And they were on the afternoon of, they were abducted together on the afternoon of July 25th. August the 3rd, 1973, Corll killed his last victim, 13-year-old boy from South Houston named James Stanton Dramalia. And Dramalia was buried in the boat shed. On the evening of August the 7th, 1973, Henley, at that point was age 17, invited 19-year-old named Timothy Cordell Curley to attend a party at Corll's Pasadena residence. Curley was a casual acquaintance of Corll's, and he was intended to be a victim, and Brooks was not there at that time. It was just Henley and them. They went there to have a party, and they had invited a friend, Rhonda Louise Williams, and Williams was not supposed to be there, and they had passed out. They had got intoxicated and passed out, and Henley woke up to find himself gagged and tied up, and both Williams and Curley were beside him, gagged and tied up, and Corll took the gag out of his mouth, and Henley asked him what was going on, and Corll told him that he was going to murder all three of them. And Corll told him that, saying that pretty much he was going to, go ahead and kill them all. And he protested and threatened him, and he told Corll that he would participate with the murders of Curley and Williams if he would let him go. And at this point, Curley and Williams had woke up, and they understood what was going on, and asked him, what was going on, and was he going to do anything about it. And he had let Henley go, and Henley agreed with Corll that he would sexually assault Williams, and he could sexually assault Curley. And he asked could he take Williams into the other room, and Corll had disagreed with it. Well, then they started arguing again, and Corll ignored him, and Henley grabbed Corll's gun, his pistol, and ended up shooting Corll, and that's how Corll ended up passing away that night. And the three, he untied Williams and Curley, and they talked and discussed what was going on, and he said he was going to call the police, and they called the police, and that's how Dean Arnold Corll passed away. Henley shot him. And there's a lot of left out, and if you're interested in the story, please look it up, and please watch other videos, and thank you for your time. Thank you.